Hello, welcome to COM 222 Intercultural Communications. Today we're going to talk about cultural identity, specifically American Indians, Caucasians, and Chicanos or Chicanas. So we're going to start off with the American Indian identity. And most of us, when we think of American Indians, we have this old West image where they all have the same cultural characteristics and they're perceived to be living the movie version of life. And most of these movie characters are overgeneralized, stereotypical images with absolutely no depth. So, most of us have never really experienced what it is to be an American Indian. We see him on TV. We saw the guy with the teardrop when we had pollution issues in the 70s. We've seen movies like Dances with Wolves, where Mary McDonnell, a very Irish-looking person, played an American Indian. So, again, we're not really that familiar with the folks who came from this area. Ganji contends that Indian stereotypes are propagated through false images of Indians as either spirit guides or noble savages, in much the same way as women are seen as mothers or whores, and that's a dialectical opposite, and that's the same thing with Indians. They're either very spiritual and helpful, or they are savages in the sense that they want their land back. Not all Indians worship inanimate objects, such as rocks or thunder. However, most do have a respect for environmental elements stemming from an indigenous worldview. Many Indians are Christians and do not believe in many gods or spirits and are not able to withstand pain any better than their non-Indian counterparts. And that was an old prejudice or a stereotype that American Indians didn't feel pain the same way that non-Indians. Most people are unaware of the difference between Indian-ness and Tribal-ness. These two terms are often intertwined and used synonymously, yet they mean very different things. The cultural decline and/or transformation of many American Indian tribes is due to such influencing factors as language loss, intermarriage, death of elders, and relocation. These factors have contributed to tribes moving away from their basic nature of cultural competency. So, for hundreds of thousands of years, when Native Americans lived in North America, they were a nomadic lifestyle, meaning they didn't set down roots, they didn't have villages, they would move along with the seasons, and they did have camps where they had the teepees and raised children, but the men would often travel great distances for hunting and trading. So when we think of American Indians of the pre-1790, 1800 era, they had a communal lifestyle that was absolutely antithetical to the capitalist lifestyle. For centuries, Indians centered their lives around tribalness, which eventually gave way to Indian-ness as the most recognized mode of social identity. So if you say that you're part of the Choctaw tribe, or you're part of the Cherokee tribe, we as Americans know that that's an Indian tribe. We don't know the specifics about the difference between Cherokees and the Navajo, for example. Tribalness is the specific cultural aspects of each tribe, such as language, marrying within the tribe, and death rituals. So if you compare this to the concept in Europe, you have Irish people and Italian people, Spanish people and French people. They're all European, but each country has its own characteristics and culture. So it's the same concept in the United States. All these tribes had their own individual culture, and then when Americans, especially in the 1800s, started the westward expansion, we literally pushed Indians out of the way, and they became much more generalized in their identity. So a tribalness was subverted by the reservation and relocation system, and this led to the more generalized focus on them being Indians opposed to their tribal identity. Indian-ness replaced tribalness as a form of social identity. This part of the PowerPoint investigates several areas of what Pratt identifies as Indian-ness, such as what is an Indian, in other words, how is it defined, what is problematic in researching Indians, and what are some of the contemporary issues of American Indian identity. The goal is to focus on American identity for the American Indians, to formulate and articulate the problem of what it means to actually identify, and more importantly, to begin the discussion of what constitutes Indian identity. The focus on American Indian identity is in terms of identity negotiations, as well as what it means to be an Indian in contemporary American society, with Indian-ness as the keystone. Although each American Indian tribe is divergent, especially geographically and language-wise, the existence and overlap of communicative commonalities create a unified, indigenous worldview that we refer to as Indian-ness. For Indian people, the question of identity is not restricted to identification for tribal and federal social services, but also for purposes of determining the cultural competency or Indian-ness of a person who self-identifies as an American Indian. If one chooses to be a member of a racial, cultural, or gendered group, all one simply has to do is self-identify, comport oneself in a culturally competent manner, be identified by other group members, or be identified by out-group members as a member of a particular group. So, you may have seen a commercial for one of those Ancestry DNA things, and the guy is wearing lederhosen, and he's talking about how his family always thought they were German, and they did German things, and they ate German food, and then he had his ancestry done, and it turns out he's Scottish. So now he's wearing a kilt. This is a self-determining idea in many ways. You know, sure, he's Scottish. He might also be a couple percent Spanish, 10% from the Middle East. You know, we all came from the same place. So, you know, we self-identify our culture, and nobody questions us. And that's the important thing to keep in mind. Many people fail to understand the nature of tribal or Indian identity. We do not ask white people, how much white are you? Or how much white blood do you have? Now, obviously, this was something that was addressed in the 1800s and early 1900s with, you know, the end of slavery and people falling in love. And if somebody had any African American blood in them, it became a big deal. And it was just, again, another reinforcing aspect of how identity can be negated by society. So identity is only examined when it is called into question. People who are part of the majority culture do not need to validate their identity on a daily basis, the way that American Indians do. Instead, American Indians go through the endless process of establishing, confirming, and demonstrating what is termed Indian-ness. American Indians must provide governmental documentation of tribal blood quantum. Depending on the tribe, you need somewhere between 1/16 to a quarter unless they can validate their ancestry by tracing your background to the original list of Indians as a requirement for membership and subsequent federal identification. You have to get a blood test to show how much of an Indian you are, and no other culture requires that in the United States. Members of American Indian tribes must provide the documentation in order to enjoy the constitutionally protected rights that are granted to all citizens except the American Indian. Constitutional privileges such as the right to worship in a culturally sanctioned manner, access to health care, voting in tribal elections, management of personal monies, choices of housing, and opportunities for employment hinge upon governmental certification. And again, we can all go all the way back to that guy who sits on your $20 bill, Andrew Jackson, who led the Indian Wars. And he became president because he made America safe for the white man. And again, what we look here is that was a different time, and the rules still haven't changed all that much for American Indians. Rather than attempting to identify specific cultural speech behaviors, for example, compliance, gaining, listening, contemporary research has categorized and compared observable cultural communicative acts with European American behavior equivalents. However, recent ethnographic research has begun identifying and explaining Indian speech acts and communicative behaviors. So, up until recently, we didn't look at how different tribes communicated within their own tribe or across tribes. Instead, we were comparing Indians as a monolithic group to how Europeans acted. Researchers are seeing that there is not one common type of Indian identity, nor a standard set of behaviors that can be generalized to all Indians. Scholars and researchers have developed a significant amount of work on African American identity, Asian American identity, and Hispanic American identity. However, research is almost devoid of identity research when it comes to American Indian experience. Communication is the medium through which identity is expressed. Specifically, we are interested in how Indians communicate their Indian-ness. Culture, identity, and in-group membership are interlaced with the threads of interpretation and social discourse. This perspective allows us to illustrate how Indian-ness is created by the manner in which Indian people speak to others and how others speak to them. One of the problems that researchers have uncovered as they're trying to research Indians is how to define what makes a real, i.e. culturally competent American Indian. So some of the ideas that have been set forth include is the presence of a certificate of degree of Indian blood, proof of Indian-ness. If a person simply looks Indian, does that automatically qualify him or her for the study? What if the individual merely self-identifies as Indian or claims to be a member of a particular tribe? Should a researcher ask for proof of cultural competency, i.e. requesting to see their certificate of degree of Indian blood card? So, in this way, you can see that researchers who study American Indians encounter identity issues from the start. Unlike any other cultural group, American Indian identity is called into question even when making themselves available to be studied. Are the issues associated with labeling identity to this cultural group the reason for the absence of research? So, now that we've had a little taste of what it is culturally to be an American Indian, we want to look at the folks who kind of came in and took over North America. And this is from an article called Understanding Whiteness in the United States by Judith N. Martin. The guy on the right is the current House Speaker, Paul Ryan. He had run as a vice presidential candidate, and he is resigning as of 2018. For many people in the United States, there currently seems to be a degree of confusion and angst about racial and ethnic identity among white people. Some people never think about being white. some think it seems all right to feel ethnic pride, but not pride in being white. So you can have Irish pride, Italian pride, Puerto Rican pride, you can have German pride at Oktoberfest, but walking around and saying white pride seems very inappropriate. Some feel that they are being forced to think about being white because of issues like affirmative action and reverse discrimination. You know, especially right now in today's contemporary society, we're seeing a lot of white people say, oh, you know, I'm being treated poorly just because I'm a white guy. And then the reality is, no, you're just being treated like everybody else has been treated for the past 2,000 years of civilization. We will examine how being white in the United States may influence communication, particularly in terms of how this identity develops and is reflected in the labels and words we use to refer to ourselves. We all have multiple identities, such as our gender, religious background, ethnicity, race. So you could be a Catholic woman who is white and Italian, that make up our self-concept and how we see ourselves. And you could easily list 20 ways of describing yourself. Everything from gender to height to weight to who you were in terms of your high school clique. Identities arise from associations with groups, some voluntary, such as professional and religious affiliations, and some involuntary, such as your age and family group, and then develop through communications with others. Cultural identities are negotiated, co-created, reinforced, and challenged through communication. Some identities may be easier to co-create and negotiate than others. For example, does it seem easier to understand and negotiate being female than being white? How is being white negotiated and challenged through communication in today's world? 3 issues need to be addressed as we apply this communication perspective to understanding white identity. Number 1, the difference between white racial and ethnic identity. Number 2, the characteristics of white identity. And number 3, how whites develop a sense of being white. What is the difference between racial and ethnic identity? Many people believe that race has to do with physical characteristics, whereas ethnicity is more a sense of shared culture, belief system, and origin. However, scholars now reject the biological argument in favor of a more social approach to understanding race. It probably makes more sense to talk about race formation and to think about race as a complex of social meaning that gets interpreted through communication rather than as something fixed, concrete, and objective. It should also be pointed out that as socially constructed, these categories are relational and exist in relation to each other. Could there be white people without black people? What does it mean that we tend to see race in the United States in polar categories of white and black, whereas other countries may see race as irrelevant and the ethnic identity as the way to express identity? So, if you go to Africa, where the vast majority of people are black or brown, and you go to somewhere like Rwanda, and you have the Hutu tribe and the Tutsi tribe, and they fought their own civil war about 20 years ago and decimated each other. Now, they're both black, it's just the tribal or their ethnic identity that they're using. If people do not fit or do not want to fit into these categories, how can they negotiate their identity? The relationship between white racial and ethnic identity can be clarified by distinguishing between bounded and dominant identities. Bounded cultures are those groups we belong to that are specific and not dominant or normative, such as groups defined by religion, gender, and ethnicity. However, what it means to belong to the dominant or normative white culture is a much more slippery construct and more difficult to define. It is not often easy to see what cultural practices or norms link white people together. For example, we usually don't think of Thanksgiving as a white American holiday. Part of the slipperiness of this identity is related to the dominant or normative aspect of being white. So the American culture has much more to do with whiteness than, the values and culture that other races bring. So, African American culture is much different than American culture because of the fact that white people have in fact created American culture. Sometimes the more powerful aspects of identity that are ascribed or involuntarily, the same thing can be true about being white. One reason white people don't think about being white is that they may not need to. The experiences and communication patterns of whites are taken as the norm from which others are marked or measured. The universal norm then becomes invisible. For example, the news media refers to black leaders, but never to white leaders, because white leaders are the norm. So what does it mean that the category white is seldom referred to, and that whites so rarely talk about what it means to be white? The lack of awareness on the part of whites may be changing. As issues of race are brought up more and more frequently in the U.S., white people are perhaps thinking more about being white than ever before, and perhaps it will become easier to identify those norms and core symbols of whiteness. Sociologist Ruth Frankenberg suggests that one way to understand whiteness is to view it not as simply a racial or ethnic category, but rather as a set of three linked dimensions in which power is the key ingredient. These are modified to emphasize the communicative aspect of identity, a location of structural advantage, a standpoint from which to view ourselves and others, and a set of cultural practices, i.e., core symbols, labels, and norms. So we're going to start talking now about this concept called white privilege. And privilege, particularly white or male privilege, is hard to see for white people who were born with access to power and resources. However, it is very visible for those to whom privilege was not granted. The Random House Dictionary defines privilege as a right, immunity, or benefit enjoyed only by a person beyond the advantages of most. In other words, white privilege is not realizing that the opportunities that are available to them are not always available to others. How is this dimension of white identity played out in the everyday lives of white people and their communication with others? Now, I just want to show you this cartoon over here on the right-hand side. You have a black woman in her racing gear, and then a white guy in a suit. And this really defines white privilege. Things are just easier for white people, and especially white men. They're seen as competent right out of the gate. Even when they're dressed in construction clothes or jeans, they are given credibility. The black woman, on the other hand, has a lot more things in her path. There are a lot of things that slow a woman down, especially an African American woman, and in this case, she has the ball attached to her leg, the iron ball attached to her leg. She has all these hazards that she has to cross to get to the same finish line. So, what is a real world example? Well, think about it from this perspective. You are a white person whose dad went to a certain university. Your grades are mediocre, but because your dad went to that university, you're considered a legacy, and you will be given preferential treatment in coming to school there, even though you may not have earned it. On the other hand, someone who is African American and who is given preferential treatment using affirmative action, meaning we need to balance things in society, is going to be criticized for having an opportunity to go to the same university because they're going to say she didn't earn it. So what's the difference between somebody who's a legacy and someone who's a minority? Well, the legacy is usually somebody who is coming from the dominant society. Researcher Peggy McIntosh has tried to identify the ways in which white privilege affects her daily interactions, and I am sure you can list a lot of other ways. So, as a white person, I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. I can be fairly sure of having my voice heard in a group in which I am the only member of my race. Now, as a woman, that makes it less likely, but if I was a white man, then you would definitely listen to me. I can talk with my mouth full and not have people put me down due to my color. And that is something that people do, is they take a completely unrelated issue and ascribe it to being representative of a particular race. I can do well in a challenging situation without being called a credit to my race. So, if somebody gets a medical doctor degree and they are African American, are people running around calling them a credit to their race? Absolutely. But nobody does that to a white person because, again, the dominant society. I am never asked to speak for all people of my racial group. I can worry about racism without it being seen as self-interest or self-seeking. My culture gives me little to fear about ignoring the perspectives and powers of people of other races. The thing is, with dominant culture, you're in charge, so you don't worry about them so much. Now, in recent years, as we have seen more and more minority groups mobilize and develop economic and political power, you're beginning to see some of the lower socioeconomic white people beginning to freak out because now they're seeing other races doing well consistently, and yet they're still living in a trailer on welfare because they dropped out of school when they were 8. And again, that's not being negative to anyone other than this idea that if you're a white person, you have to do better than a black person. That's white privilege. In this change in identity, this growing awareness of a white identity is occurring because the changing demographics in the United States means that whites are beginning to perceive themselves in the minority. Gallagher also asked students to estimate the ratio of whites to black on campus. Many students reported that they thought the ratio was 30% white, 70% black. The actual ratio was 70% white and 30% black. The point here is not the inaccuracy of perception or whether whites or minorities are more privileged, but how these perceptions affect intercultural communication. And remember, and this is one of the most important things you will ever learn, is a person's perception is their reality. They truly believe something if this is how they perceive it. If you walk outside and you see the sun shining, your perception is that the sun is out and it is shining. But if somebody says to you, no, that's not right, it's the moon, they're wrong because your perception is your reality. A second dimension of white identity, according to Frankenberg, is a standpoint, a place from which white people look at themselves, at others, and at society. To give one example, according to CBS News poll reported in the Arizona Republic, 38% of whites versus 27% of blacks think race relations in the United States are generally good. And this is with a picture of a young black child being arrested by a white police officer. So that pretty much tells you. Now, there's another issue where you go into the middle of the country. Iowa, Kansas, North Dakota, South Dakota. There are hardly any black people in these states. So the white people there don't have a problem with black people because they don't have to deal with them ever. There's no cultural communications going on. Core symbols are those values and priorities of a cultural group that symbolize the norms of behavior and labels used to describe the group. Often the norms are concealed. They are not made explicit, and it is hard to identify what norms are uniquely shared by white people. Sometimes these cultural practices are most clearly visible to those who are not white, to those groups who are excluded from whiteness. So it's easier to see something from the outside looking in than the inside looking around. Janet Helms and others have attempted to outline values that are shared primarily by white people. They suggest that a strong belief in individualism and an emphasis on linear thinking are two patterns that are most strongly linked to being white and are not universally shared by other cultural groups in the United States. The labels we attach to ourselves and others that characterize ethnicity and/or race may be seen as a category of core symbols and are another way in which identity is expressed. Labels have meaning and are not neutral. The questions of labels and identity have been of concern to marginalized groups for a long time. Power comes into play again because dominant groups exercise power in naming others, and it is often difficult for the less powerful groups to control their own labels. So it is well known that Native Americans have objected to the use of the tribal term as a name for sports groups such as the Redskins, cars, Jeep Cherokee, and other commercial products. Some African Americans object to Aunt Jemima, pancake mix, and Uncle Ben's rice. Uncle Ben was a slur that was used for older black slaves, male slaves. And, of course, Aunt Jemima is the very model of a pejorative, happy, slave-looking woman ready to cook for the white folk. It is not widely known that Quakers objected strenuously to the use of the label Quaker in Quaker oats. So, we have to put it in the perspective of, would white people like a team called the Fighting Caucasians? Some people might actually like that, and that is even more scary. So now we're going to look at Hardeman's model of identity development, stage 1. How do we develop a sense of whiteness? This sense, just like our sense of gender, develops over time and through communication with others. There seems to be several stages of identity development, not with definite beginnings and ends, but staged nonetheless that represent different positions of understanding who we are. Stage 1, no social consciousness. In Hardeman's model, the first stage of identity development is the same for whites and minority groups. In this stage, children may be aware of physical differences and some cultural groups, but do not feel fearful or hostile and do not feel racially superior. As they get older, they absorb the message from the social environment, i.e. family and the society in which you live, about racial groups. Stage 2, acceptance. The second stage, acceptance, represents the internalization of the message about racial group membership and the acquisition of a belief in the normalcy or superiority of being white. This may be either a passive acceptance or an active acceptance of the dominant socialization. An important point here is that individuals at this stage are not aware that they have been programmed to accept a particular worldview about race. It is simply the way things are and is not questioned. So, picture on the right-hand side, you will see Vice President Pence meeting with a group of representatives, all of whom are older white men. No women, no African Americans. It is a sea of whiteness. And again, this is the idea that, yeah, we're white, we are in charge. Passive acceptance, there is no conscious identification with being white. Whites at this stage may hold the following subtly racist views, but do not see themselves as being racist. Rather, racism is seen as the holding of extreme attitudes, such as those espoused by the Ku Klux Klan. People at this stage usually take one of two passive positions with respect to racial issues and interactions with people of color. They either avoid or adopt a patronizing or condescending stance. Active acceptance. Those whites in the active acceptance stage are very conscious of their whiteness and may express their feelings of superiority collectively, as with sometimes colleges allow a white student union. There may be open resentment toward minorities who are perceived to be more advantaged. Why do all the black students sit together in the student union? Some whites never move beyond this phase. If they do, it is usually a result of a number of cumulative events. And again, what we have to kind of think about in sociology, there is a theory called social interaction, which says the more we interact with one another, the more comfortable we are, and the more we understand each side of the perspective. So that makes sense. It seems like a very straightforward idea. There are some people who just resist any desire to get to know someone outside of their own race or culture. Black is beautiful. That's discriminatory. I don't see color. We should all be equal. No Black History Month. Please comb your hair. Minorities actually have more privileges. And that's really the general party line of the white supremacy groups, is that the blacks, the Mexicans, the immigrants coming from Central America, they all have more rights than white people do. But when you actually look at the facts, that is absolutely wrong. And speak to anyone who is a minority, and they will tell you that this idea that they have more rights than white people do is just ridiculous. Resistance, stage 3. The resistance stage represents a major attitudinal shift from a position that blames victims for their condition to the one that names and blames a white's own dominant group as the source of racial problems. Some may try to distance themselves from other whites or gravitate toward community of color. However, as they make the transition to the next stage, they realize that while they may appreciate communities of color, they are not members of those cultures, and they feel a need to redefine their whiteness. So you have somebody who may have been a little racist or prejudicial when they were younger, and there's a great song from the Broadway show Avenue Q, Everyone's a Little Bit Racist, which is incredibly funny and incredibly true. But, you go to, through life with experiences, and you may realize that, I feel terrible about how black people are treated, but I know I'm not somebody in the black culture, so I could never truly understand the depth of their challenges. But I need to redefine my own sense of identity because I don't want to associate or be associated with groups like the Nazis and the skinheads and the white supremacists. So, in stage 4, redefinition, in this stage, energy is refocused or redirected to redefining whiteness in non-racist terms. However, the difficult challenge here is to identify what white culture is. Sometimes this can be done only by coming into contact with and interacting with people of color before moving on to redefine one's own white identity. A second task is to identify the ways in which racism is harmful to whites. and to move beyond thinking that racism affects only people of color. So, racism in and of itself is inherently bad. And we, no matter what your race is, need to move towards a reconciliation that everybody feels some measure of prejudice or discrimination, even if you're a white guy. Stage 5, internalization. In this stage, whites are finally able to integrate their whiteness into all facets of their identity, and this affects other aspects of social and personal identity, their sex role, their religious role, and so on. At this point, there is less consciousness about identity. All aspects are internalized and manifested in spontaneous behavior. So here's somebody, Bill Gates, I'm sure you've heard of him, and he's a guy who has billions and billions and billions of dollars. And he has taken it as a personal mission to help the entire continent of Africa become more developed in the sense of providing free computers, netting to prevent mosquito bites, and mosquitoes in Africa, many parts of Africa, carry disease, even setting up vaccines and other medications. So here's this white guy who really has no vested interest in Africa, but is doing everything he can to try and help. Now, from a cynical perspective, you could say, well, sure, he's going to sell a bunch of Microsoft products and make more billions. But at some point, when you have so many billions of dollars and that you are using that money to help out an entire continent of people, you have to kind of give somebody a little credit and say, yeah, here's somebody who cares about the world. So moving on, we're going to talk about the Chicana ethnicity. And this is from an essay by James Stephen Sauceda, and it's called A Concept in Search of a Content. So we need to understand where the terms Mexican American or Chicano, Chicana come from. In 1848, the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, a new phrase was added to the political vocabulary of the United States, the Mexican American. This label was assigned to a highly heterogeneous group, formerly known as Mexicanos or Mexicans. The formal entrance of American culture came in Mexico as a result of President Polk's land grab against Mexico, taking over parts of Texas, New Mexico, California, a move that Abraham Lincoln and Henry Clay considered a calculated and unconstitutional war. So, we may not have been the most fair when we did this, but we basically did a land grab. Today, the term Mexican American is more likely to be the identifying label of a second-generation person than of a third-generation person. So, Mexican descent may constitute for Chicanos or Chicanas a positive value, a negative value, or more generally an ambiguous blend of the two. Many Mexican Americans sought to establish Chicano, Chicana as the more accurate term to use. It is not a dogmatic position, meaning stubborn, but only a personal attempt to establish a more precise vocabulary for ethnic study of this group. And remember, what we learn about different ethnicities comes from research which has to follow certain requirements, of which defining the variables is one of the most important parts. The most basic ethnic assumption regarding the Chicano, Chicana is that he or she shares a common culture. Typically, it is assumed that the Chicano, Chicana shares a traditional Mexican culture. What are the specific Mexican cultural traits? Over the years, researchers have compiled a fairly consistent list of such traits. The existence of and reliance upon an extended family. a non-joining attitude, that is, refusal to join any volunteer associations. Maintenance of traditional values, in other words, a high resistance to change. Staunch anti-intellectualism. Behavior dominated by a machismo complex, and that's where the men have to be super macho all the time. And the inability to be future-oriented and a fatalistic attitude, which is also called cultural passivity, meaning if it's God's will, it's going to happen. I can't do anything to change it. These traits do seem to establish specific cultural characteristics and therefore appear proper for use as true generalizations of the common cultural background of Chicanos. Importantly, however, researcher Cassavetes, as well as Romano and others, have convincingly argued that all of those so-called cultural traits are in fact only generalized descriptions of any group of people living in poverty. What researchers have typically done is mistake behaviors determined by economic conditions, the most elemental prerequisite for Chicana attributes. Chicana ethnic membership. The result has been an enduring psychological identification of Chicano or Chicana and subjective as anti-intellectual acceptance or into non-joiners the presumed and identity so of the group. So again, it's this idea of naming yourself, accepting the identity. This definition of Chicano-Chicana ethnicity rests upon the psychological constructs of identification and acceptance, not upon any genetic, socioeconomic, historic, or demographic features, though the latter may encourage identification and acceptance. This definition is based upon an earlier one of Max Weber's. It was he who correctly postulated that the locus of ethnicity is psychological. A person does not have to believe that one shares a common descent to be a member of the ethnic group. So if your great-great-great-grandfather came from Mexico, and since then you've gotten some French in you, Italian, Irish, maybe African American, you still may feel, because of the culture of your family, that Chicano identity most keenly as opposed to the rest of the identities that you have inherited from your family. Ethnicity at its core is a complex of styles of behavior resulting from existential anxiety and fear of isolation. In short, ethnicity is essentially a mechanism to reduce individual alienation by creating a sense of community. The source of ethnicity is existential despair, the sense that you are facing your mortal self and the unbearable truth of your inevitable death. That's why our life's purpose and the responsibilities of each day drive us forward. Existential despair can lead to a psychological identification with the ethnic group which one implicitly understands or explicitly is told he or she inherently belongs within. But the resultant sense of community, which is attributable to social validation the group provides, is confused often with the similar history of one's heritage. So in a sense, existentialism drives us to find a community, to find an identity, to find a sense of belonging. There's an excellent book by Jean-Paul Sartre. He was a famous existential philosopher called Nausea. And it's about this wealthy man who every time he picks up a physical object feels nauseated. And he prefers solitude to spending time with people. And he learns through the course of this book that the more time he spends with people, the more he can enjoy the objects in his life, because people reduce the nausea of alienation. I know, it sounds deep, but like I said, it was a existential perspective. So one of the things that we have to do is we have to separate ethnicity from attributes. And remember, attributes are the characteristics that people place upon you in many ways. The Chicano-Chicana ethnicity is then basically a metaphysical reality or a physical illusion. It must be remembered that all the alleged ethnic attributes of common culture, religion, and so on are possibly symptoms or badges of ethnicity, but they are not in and of themselves ethnicity. Can we take on a different identity? And this is a big question for a lot of people. An example confirming the idea that Chicano-Chicana ethnicity is psychological was found recently in the Los Angeles Times. In an article written by Gerald Haslam, the career of one Amado Murrow was explored. Murrow, who died in 1971, was considered by many to be the funniest, brightest, most moving, accomplished, and prolific of modern Chicano writers. The point of Haslam's article was that there was no Murrow. There had never been a Murrow. The Amado Murrow was a pseudonym taken by a man named Chester Seltzer, a middle-aged white journalist who had taken his wife's maiden name as his writing name. So, you have this Gerald Haslam, which sounds could be Swedish, could be British, but clearly an Anglo name, and wrote about the Chicano experience in a moving way that many Chicanos admired. So the question then is, what is right or wrong about taking on an identity? Chicano-Chicana as an ethnic membership is created by racist intolerance and stereotypic classifications imposed by mainstream American society. It is ironic that the non-Chicano population defines what it means to be a Chicano. When a group endures the racist stereotypes by the dominant society, an individual's behavior that resembles the behaviors that society labels ethnic, that individual is involuntarily made ethnic. The result of 132 years of calculated discrimination in America has produced notions of Chicano or Chicana ethnicity that are inescapable as they are false. For instance, many people in Los Angeles believe if you wear starched khaki pants, a long plaid Pendleton shirt, and a bandana set low over your eyes, that you're not only Mexican, but a criminal. Not only a criminal, but a knife-carrying, dirty gang member type of criminal, and so on. So, really that's what the issue is about taking on a minority identity if you can't really validate it in terms of your historical precedents. There were stories in the 50s and 60s of really light-skinned black women passing for white, and it was to gain the benefits of white society. You rarely see somebody who wants to move in the opposite direction, become part of a culture that is stereotyped, discriminated, and basically subordinated by the dominant society. So, many minorities identify with the identity that society has created for them, and they live out the stereotypes of this oftentimes criminality. But their criminal behavior is still the result of the criminal conditions created and perpetuated against them by the dominant power structure. If you are put in a box, can you easily get out of that box? If someone categorizes you as an idiot, can you get out of that? If someone categorizes you as an African American, do you even want to get out of that? Minority artists have historically been propelled by a cultural impulse that is disassociative, not integrative in terms of the minority's ability to creatively borrow and incorporate aspects from the mainstream. Usually, any minority who attempts to grow through direct transaction with Anglo culture is indicted as an ethnic sellout. The dream of some pure ethnic vision will never come true. The reality is that this purity is tainted. Instead, race is an amalgamation of different experiences in addition to the color of one's skin. So really what we're looking at here with race and ethnicity is our experiences, what we have gone through growing up, growing older. And, the color of our skin plays a part in generalizing you, but, your identity then is given to you rather than you emerging organically with that identity. Now, this is an interesting case study. Rachelle Dolezal is a white woman who represented herself as a black woman for years and once headed a local chapter of the NAACP in Washington State. Dolezal made headlines in 2015 after her relatives revealed that she was born white and had posed as a black woman for years. At the time, she headed the Spokane, Washington chapter of the NAACP and taught African American studies at a local university. So what you have here is somebody who is, the very essence of a white girl. She's got the blonde hair, she's got the pale skin, she's got the freckles, she's got the whole innocence thing going on. And whatever happened in her world led her to passing as an African American woman. Whether she's getting a tan or using tanning solution, whatever she's done to her hair, if she's wearing a wig, all of these things represent the stereotype identity of a black woman. Some defended her by pointing to her activism as a leader, while others blasted her and said she had diminished the struggles of African Americans. Despite the backlash, she maintains that she is a transracial black woman. So the question is, and this is what you should be thinking about, do you think Rachelle Dolezal has the right to choose to live as a black woman? Would a black woman be able to pass as a white woman unless she was very, very light-skinned? And again, there's all kinds of questions that are related to this issue, but ultimately, identity is something very personal, very sometimes imposed upon us by society, and yet underneath it all, we can sometimes key into that essential identity that we aim to achieve. So that's it for today. If you have any questions, please email or text message your instructor. If you do not attend our college but still have a question, please leave a comment and we will respond as quickly as we can. Thank you and have a fabulous day.